The fog lay thick over the tree line, a pale, colourless veil stretched across the early morning fields of eastern Poland. It was the kind of fog that swallowed sound, where even the distant thrum of engines became a dull, muted heartbeat under the earth. Dawn had not yet broken, but the world seemed suspended in a dim half-light, neither night nor day, only waiting. And in that stillness, a young Polish sapper named Corporal Alexander Rosicky knelt alone beside a rusted shovel, half buried in the mud. His gloves were torn, his breath smoked in the cold, and every few seconds he stopped working, lifted his head and listened. There it was again, that faint engine murmur. German, light vehicles, maybe a reconnaissance patrol. Maybe more. The moisture in the air had begun gathering on his eyelashes, turning into cold droplets. He wiped them away with the back of his hand and went back to the tiny pit in the ground. It didn't look like much. A mangled shovel head wedged into a narrow slot of clay, its handle removed long ago, the metal warped from years of use. But the sapper treated it like a precious instrument, adjusting the angle degree by degree. Behind him, the rest of his platoon slept in a ruined barn, unaware he had slipped out before dawn. The long November night had been spent marching, repositioning, retreating, advancing again, the endless rhythm of 1944. They were part of a battered resistance battalion attached to the Polish Home Army, shadowing German traffic and disrupting supply routes, feeding east toward the collapsing front. Every mine, every ambush, every hour of delay mattered. But Corporal Rosicky was not placing a standard mine. He had none left. He inhaled sharply, hearing leaves crackle, somewhere in the fog, perhaps a fox, perhaps more. His fingers worked with quiet urgency, looping a thin steel tripwire around two stakes he'd driven inches above the soil. The line ran taut in front of the shovel's jagged edge, a simple improvised mechanism, a laughably simple one. He had tried explaining it to the battalion's engineering officer 4 days earlier. "Sir, when the vehicle hits the wire, the tension releases the catch. The shovel snaps upward into the axle or tie rod. It's old metal but sharp enough. At 20 or 30 kilometers per hour, it'll rip the steering clean out. Might flip a light chassis." He never finished the explanation. The officer had waved him off. "A shovel is not an anti-vehicle device, Corporal. We fight with weapons, not trash. Don't waste time on this." But Alexander couldn't stop thinking about the scout cars he'd watched sweep their ambush sites, clean recon vehicles that were too light to trigger buried mines and too fast for riflemen to hit reliably. They were the eyes of the German reserves, and blinding them mattered. And so he had continued, quietly, alone, working in the shadows after marching, sketching diagrams in the dirt, testing tension cables, searching for debris he could use as springs. If the officers wouldn't approve a prototype, he would make one from whatever he could carry in his pack. Now that improvised creation lay before him, a rusted shovel head fixed to a simple tension bar, the tripwire connected to a release pin fashioned from a barn hinge. Everything coated in mud, everything unknown, everything depending on a single fragile pull. He had selected this patch of road carefully, a narrow dirt track descending from a wooded ridge, funneling into a shallow bend that forced vehicles to slow and straighten. The fog would hide his movements, mute any clatter. He dug shallow grooves to hide the wire-brushed leaves over the stakes and pressed the moist earth flat with his palms. It looked like undisturbed ground, at least in this pale light. His heartbeat quickened. The engines were closer now. A low growl, then two distinct notes, one lighter, one heavier. Perhaps ASD. KFZ. 221 or 222, the light armored scout cars used constantly across the region. Quick, agile, and deadly to exposed infantry. Alexander wiped his hands on his tunic, lifted his pack, and slipped to the roadside ditch, crawling on elbows and knees through wet brambles. He positioned himself behind a fallen birch trunk, the bark soft and peeling beneath his fingers. The fog thickened, swallowing him entirely. Moments stretched. The engine rumble grew into shape, metallic clatter, the rattle of suspension, then the crunch of tires on frozen soil. He felt each vibration through the earth. The road glowed faintly as headlights pierced the mist. He checked the tripwire angle again through a gap in the brush. It shimmered almost invisibly, just a thin glint reflecting the pale light. Alexander whispered under his breath, a habit from months of clandestine work. Hold. Just hold. The first vehicle emerged from the fog, a motorcycle with sidecar, moving cautiously, the machine gunner scanning the tree line. Alexander pressed deeper into the undergrowth, barely daring to breathe. The motorcycle passed the wire harmlessly. It was too low to hit. He let it go. This trap wasn't for the motorcycle. Then he heard it, the louder rumble behind it. He knew the sound immediately. A lightly armored scout car, probably a 222, with its open turret and engine whining under the thin plating. The fog parted like a curtain as it approached, its headlights searching the road. Alexander gripped the bark so tightly his knuckles turned white. The front bumper reached the wire, the tripline twanged, a split-second snap. A harsh metallic crack as the rusted shovel blade shot upward with the force of the release tension, invisible from above, inevitable from below. The shovel head slammed into the front axle assembly with a sharp, ringing impact. The scout car jerked violently to the left, wheels twisting out of alignment. The driver had no time to react. The steering column wrenched sideways, the chassis tipped, and the vehicle lurched off the road into the ditch. The world exploded in noise, metal grinding, shouts in German, the cracking of branches, a burst of sparks as the undercarriage scraped stone. Alexander froze. It had worked. The same officers who banned the device had called it junk. Yet here it was, his rusted shovel tripwire, disabling a German scout car in less than a second. The motorcycle skidded to a halt ahead, the gunner turning in confusion, unable to see through the fog what had happened behind him. Alexander backed away slowly, silently, heart pounding. This was only the beginning. The Germans would react. They would search. They would learn. But so would his battalion, and by nightfall, every man in his unit would hear the same whispered story. The shovel trap worked. The fog had begun to lift by midday, burned away by a pale November sun that never truly warmed the land. Across eastern Poland in late 1944, the war was a wounded machine clattering toward its final convulsions. Soviet spearheads pressed westward in relentless waves, while German columns scrambled to plug holes that widened by the hour. Between these two giants lay the fragments of smaller armies' resistance, cells, retreating remnants, scattered units fighting on roads choked with refugees and wrecked vehicles. For the men of the Polish Home Army's 32nd Sapper Platoon, this chaos was both shield and battlefield. Officially, they were auxiliaries ordered to harass German logistics in the Praga corridor north of Siedlce. Unofficially, they moved like shadows, never sleeping in the same barn, twice never trusting the horizon. They were too lightly armed for real battles, too experienced to die in pointless ones. Their commander, Major Tadeusz Wysocki, had received new instructions from Regional Command just 2 days earlier. Slow German reconnaissance moving toward the Vistula. Blind their movements, delay at every opportunity, simple words, impossible mission. German reconnaissance in this sector was dominated by fast-moving patrols of motorcycles, Kübelwagens, and the armored reconnaissance cars of the Aufklärungsabteilung 5, part of the hardened 5th Panzer Division. These vehicles probed the countryside, constantly mapping every lane and forest track that Soviet forces might use to outflank the German line. They were the division's eyes and the Home Army's torment. Every time the Poles tried to stage an ambush, the German scouts had already swept the area minutes beforehand. Every retreat route became exposed. Every farmhouse shelter risked betrayal. The scouts never stayed long, but their presence meant that heavier units soon followed. Half-tracks, armored cars, sometimes tanks. If the scouts saw you, you didn't survive the day. That was why Major Wysocki needed the sappers, and why he was angry he couldn't give them more. Supplies were the platoon's curse. They had explosives, but never enough. They had a few true anti-tank mines relics from earlier in the war, but the Germans had learned to recognize the disturbed earth they left behind. Worse, the scout cars were too light to trigger many of the Home Army's older fuses. A 222 could roll directly over a standard mine and escape with nothing but a dented rim. It was in this climate that Corporal Alexander Rosicki had made his strange request. He had approached the engineering officer, Lieutenant Renkowski, carrying a rusted shovel head scavenged from an abandoned farmyard. The lieutenant had laughed at first, then scolded him for wasting time on fantasies. Rosicki's explanation of tension, fulcrum angle, and axle deflection hadn't mattered. It wasn't regulation, it wasn't standard, it wasn't a weapon. But war destroys the meaning of such words. A weapon is whatever saves the man beside you. After the morning fog incident after the scout car lay crippled in a ditch, its axle torn nearly in half, everything changed. The platoon had retreated west into the woods, melting into the brush before the Germans could form a search party. By noon, word had spread through the entire battalion. Men spoke in hushed excitement, while cleaning rifles, while boiling potatoes, while studying their frayed maps. Rosicki's trap. It toppled an armored car. With a shovel, no, not toppled, crippled, sent it off the road like it had hit a stone wall. A shovel, a rusted one. God help us, we should put him in charge of engineering. By late afternoon, even Major Wysocki had requested a description. And in a tone of irritation he was trying very hard to hide, Lieutenant Renkowski admitted, "Yes, sir, it apparently worked. Yet if the trap was born from desperation, the desperation had deeper roots. The Home Army in this region was alone. The Soviets pushed forward, but rarely coordinated with local resistance. Stalin's priorities were political, not tactical. A strong Polish underground threatened his plans for post war control, and though the Red Army grudgingly accepted sabotage support, they offered little help. In some cases, they disarmed or detained Home Army units outright. The Germans, cornered and brutal, showed no mercy to partisans. Thus the Polish fighters lived in a suspended world, hunted by one side and distrusted by the other. In such a world, a rusted shovel was not a symbol of madness but survival. That evening, the platoon gathered in a dry ravine to plan their next movement. The men sat in circles around small piles of pine needles instead of fires, for smoke would betray their location. The low murmur of their voices carried through the still air. Rosicki sat apart for a moment, staring at his hands still raw from digging, still trembling from adrenaline he had not yet shaken. His close friend, Private Merk Janovich, nudged him with an elbow. "You heard the officer," Merk whispered. "He wants you to explain it again, this time without the shovel in your hand. He thinks you might hit him with it." Alexander managed a faint smile. "I'm no inventor," he said. "It was just obvious." "That's why it worked," Merk replied. A small group approached Major Wysocki, Lieutenant Renkowski, and several squad leaders. They knelt around Rosicki and asked without contempt this time to see the design. Alexander drew it slowly in the dirt, the stakes, the tension bar, the release pin, the shovel blade arranged to strike the vulnerable steering assembly. As he spoke, the officers exchanged looks that were not mocking now, but assessing. Renkowski finally exhaled. "It shouldn't work," he whispered. "But the axle on those scout cars is exposed. The steering rod is nearly naked beneath the hull. At the right angle at 20 kilometers per hour it snaps the joint." Rosicki finished. "Any faster and it shears the housing too." The major rubbed his forehead. "How many can you make?" Alexander blinked. I don't know, sir. 10, maybe 15. Depends on what scrap we find, and how long to teach the others." "A few hours, then teach them." Those 3 words shifted the course of the battalion's next week. A simple idea dismissed out of hand had become a sanctioned weapon. not because it looked like one, but because that morning on the foggy ridge it had changed the rhythm of the war, if only for a moment. Blinding the German scouts meant freeing the Polish fighters to move. It meant ambushes would not be preempted. It meant German patrols would be tentative, hesitant, looking for threats buried not only beneath the soil, but woven into the very shape of the road. As the men dispersed to gather tools, wire, and scrap metal, the major placed a hand on Alexander's shoulder. "Corporal," he said, "in war, ingenuity weighs more than steel. Remember that." Alexander nodded quietly. He had not meant to challenge authority. He had not meant to create anything revolutionary. He had simply seen a weakness and swung an old shovel at it. Tomorrow, the Germans would discover that the foggy morning was not an accident. It was a warning. The forest around the ravine grew darker as night settled over the land. A thin wind whispered through the pines, carrying the faint scent of burning fields miles away. The men of the 32nd Sapper Platoon lay in scattered clusters, their silhouettes merging with the earth, their breaths forming pale wisps in the cold air. They murmured, sharpened knives, adjusted rifle slings, anything to keep their hands busy. But one man, Corporal Alexander Rozicki, worked with the single-minded focus of a craftsman at a bench. Before him lay a pile of rusted metal scraps, broken hinges, discarded plow-teeth, fragments of farm tools, an array of bent nails and frayed wire. To most it was useless debris. To Alexander it was a pallet. He arranged each piece by weight and tension, tapping them with the back of his knife to hear their pitch. The others watched curiosity overcoming fatigue. War had trained them to distrust impractical men, but Alexander did not look like a dreamer now. He worked like a man who had been waiting years for permission to think. A fireless lantern glowed faintly beside him, shielded with cloth to hide the light. Its dim halo revealed the concentration in his eyes, steady, calm, analytical. He turned the shovel blade in his hands, testing the wobble of its dented edge. It was older than he was, perhaps. The spine bent slightly from decades of striking stones and roots. But its imperfections were in a strange way the source of its threat. The jagged contours almost invited the stress fractures that tore into metal under sudden force. Private Mek Janovich crouched beside him, arms wrapped around his knees to keep warm. "You're going to make that many of them?" Mek asked. 15 traps from this scrap pile." "Not from all of it," Alexander said, selecting a small hinge. "Only the pieces that still have fight in them." Mek smirked faintly. "You talk about junk like it's alive. In my hands tonight," Alexander said quietly, "it is." He set the hinge against the shovel head and tested its movement. Smooth enough, strong enough. He bent the metal with slow pressure to form the base of the release mechanism. His fingers worked with a skill forged long before the war. In childhood, shaping wire toys in the courtyard. In adolescence, repairing farm tools by candlelight. In early service, maintaining demolition, equipment forbidden to break. He had always known how things wanted to break, how a tiny flaw, or a hidden angle, or a tension at the wrong place could turn a tool into a weapon. The army had never asked him for invention, only obedience. But now in this hour, invention was what they needed most. Major Wysocki approached silently, boots soft in the pine needles. "How many have you finished?" Alexander hesitated, counting. 3 complete, a 4th halfway. The major knelt, lifting one of the completed traps, examining the shovel head set against the tension bar. "And each will snap with this much force?" "Yes, sir. Enough to cripple a light axle. Enough to throw a scout car off the road if it's moving quickly. And if it's moving slowly, it will still break the steering, but the car may stay upright." The major nodded. That was enough. In this war, enough was a rare luxury. He lowered the trap gently. "Corporal, you should sleep." Alexander did not look up. "I will, sir," but he didn't. He kept working long after the officers moved on. By midnight the training began. The men assembled in a silent half-circle as Alexander stood beside a patch of dirt he had cleared. A thin moon glowed above them, filtered by drifting clouds. Someone coughed softly. Another stamped his boots to keep warm. But when Alexander knelt to demonstrate, the murmuring died completely. "This is the heart of it," he said, tapping the hinge. The tension bar holds the shovel down, the wire releases it. The spring force comes from the metal itself, no explosive needed, just physics, simple and unforgiving. He strung the tripwire low across the dirt, fastening it between two stakes barely visible in the shadow. The wire must be straight, too loose and it won't trigger, too tight and it will snap in the wind, and here he pointed to the angle. This must line up with the underside of the axle. If it's too low, it hits dirt. Too high and the car drives over it. One sapper, Private Kowalski, narrowed his eyes. "But how do we hide it without burying the mechanism?" "Leaves," Alexander said. "Pine needles, mud, but lightly. Just enough to disguise the lines, not enough to block the blade." He stepped back. The trap lay there almost invisible. He pulled the wire. The shovel head snapped upward with startling violence, striking the dirt with a ringing crack. The men flinched. That, Alexander said softly, is the sound the Germans will hear. A ripple of grim smiles spread through the ranks. By dawn, 12 men could build one. By midday, 20. Their hands blistered, their nails filled with mud and rust, but the excitement gave them energy that hunger could not sap. Alexander watched them work, saw them learn, saw them improve, and something inside him shifted. He had never wanted authority. He had never sought it. But now his creation had given him a strange kind of voice. And yet with that voice came weight. As he shaped another trap, Merck spoke quietly. "You know, some of us won't see tomorrow," he said. "Not bitter, not afraid, just stating the truth. These will kill Germans? And the Germans will hunt us harder." "I know," Alexander said. "And still you're making them." "Yes," Merck nodded slowly. "Then we'll use them, everyone." The rusted metal in Alexander's hands suddenly felt heavier. War changes the meaning of responsibility. For months he had carried a rifle. That was simple. A man fires when ordered, fights when needed. But inventing meant deciding how others lived or died. His traps could save comrades. They could provoke reprisals. They could shift the rhythm of the battlefield. They could also fail. That fear sat with him like a second shadow. But he also remembered the sound of the scout car crashing into the ditch, the brief moment when an idea that existed only in his mind had changed the world outside it. If even one trap saved a patrol, if one delayed a German column, if one gave a Soviet brigade time to bypass a roadblock, then the risk was worth it. That night, as the platoon moved out to plant the first wave of shovel traps along the forest roads, Alexander paused at the tree line and looked back at the ravine where the work had begun. The moonlight glinted off the rusted metal tucked into his pack. He whispered to himself, not a prayer, not a vow, but a simple truth. Tomorrow, the roads won't belong to them anymore. And with that, he disappeared into the darkness, leading a line of men armed not with mines or grenades, but with shovels sharpened into defiance. The forest road stretched ahead in a narrow ribbon, swallowed by darkness and the scent of wet pine. The moon was a thin silver scratch across the sky, its pale light drifting through the branches in broken fragments. Somewhere far to the east, a distant artillery barrage pulsed like a heartbeat, Soviet guns hammering the last German positions along the Bug River. But here deep in the woods of eastern Poland, the world was quiet. Too quiet, Alexander thought. He crouched beside the roadside, ditch-gloved hands deep in the soil as he pressed leaves over the wire. The cold seeped through his knees. His breath fogged in the night air, rising in soft clouds. Around him, the 32nd Sapper platoon moved like shadows, each man working silently at a measured pace. A dozen rusted shovel traps lay concealed across the winding forest lane, each angled to strike at just the right point beneath a reconnaissance vehicle's undercarriage. This was not an ambush, not exactly. It was something stranger, something bolder. Tonight they were not attacking the Germans. They were closing the road. Major Wysocki had chosen the location carefully, a narrow forest corridor used by German reconnaissance units to relay messages between scattered outposts. It was a communication artery, small but essential. Without it, German units on this side of the forest would be half blind. Alexander brushed dirt from his palms and rose slowly. "How many left?" he whispered. Mech, kneeling beside him with a length of wire between his teeth, muttered 3 more. "Maybe 4, depends if we can find another good stake. Use the birch branch, it's too fresh, split it, dry enough inside." Mech grunted approval. A scrap of moonlight flickered over him as he worked the wire, gleaming faintly between his fingers. Heat rose from the trap's tension spring as he set it metal, bending with a faint groan. The men had grown quick, too quick, Alexander worried. Practice was different from darkness. Darkness hid mistakes. But the road needed to be sealed before the Germans made their nightly sweep. Alexander signaled for the next pair to move forward. They slipped into the underbrush packs, rustling softly. The air tasted of iron. By midnight, they had laid 15 traps along a 600-meter stretch of road, some positioned on straightaways, others at bends, 2 near a shallow dip likely to gather fog, each one angled like the jaw of a waiting creature. At the far end of the road, a small demolition team placed a single real mine, one of their last. Not to destroy a vehicle, but to stop the column entirely. If the first vehicle hit it, the rest of the patrol would slow bunching along the road. Then the shovel traps would do the rest. It was not elegant, but it was effective. Major Wysocki gathered the men beneath a cluster of tall pines. The branches above them stirred faintly in the breeze. His voice was a low rasp. "Tonight we don't shoot unless we must. Our purpose is disruption, not battle. Once the first vehicle hits the mine, their column will slow. They'll search, and when they do," he nodded toward the road, "they'll find Rozicki's work." A few men smiled, some couldn't, many clenched their fists instinctively. Alexander felt a weight he hadn't expected settle on his chest. The responsibility was real now, manifested in every trap. Any failure might cost a life. The major continued, "We will withdraw in small groups. Stay low, stay silent, move to the rally point by dawn. If everything goes well by morning, the Germans will be stuck in that corridor until they bring recovery vehicles from the highway." "What if they find the traps before they hit them?" someone whispered. Wysocki's eyes flicked toward Alexander. He did not answer. Alexander did. "They won't," he said quietly, "not in the dark, not on a night like this." But inside he felt uncertainty knotting his stomach. The first German vehicle came at 01:13. Alexander and Merck were lying in the brush overlooking the entrance of the road, waiting only to observe. They were not there to fight. They were there to witness their work. The rumble began as a faint vibration through the soil, then voices, then the throaty hum of a light engine. A Kubelwagen first, its headlights cutting tunnels of pale gold through the trees. Behind it, the unmistakable shape of an armored car, likely ASD, KFZ 222, fast, restless, always scouting. Alexander felt his pulse quicken. The mine was 50 meters ahead. He prayed the Germans were complacent tonight. The Kubelwagen reached the bend. A flash ignited the forest floor, brief, bright, sharp. A rolling thunderclap exploded through the trees. Soil burst into the air. Metal shrieked. The lead vehicle lurched upward, then collapsed sideways, front wheel twisted beneath the chassis. Its lantern headlights spun wildly before dying in the dirt. The armored car braked hard behind it. Shouts tore through the darkness, angry, confused. Alexander pressed lower into the brush. Merck whispered, "This is it." The Germans dismounted with weapons drawn, fanning out cautiously. Their boots cracked over leaves. Flashlights stabbed through the darkness, thin spears of light dancing over the wreck. Then one beam swept across the road. Halt! Drot, drot, wire. One German had spotted the faint glint of a tripline. He knelt, tracing the wire with his gloved fingers toward the brush-covered trap. Alexander's heartbeat hammered against his ribs. The German brushed aside the leaves. A second soldier approached, leaning over his shoulder. Alexander held his breath. A faint click sounded as the wire shifted under the man's boot. The trap snapped. The shovel blade shot upward with a vicious crack, missing the soldier's leg by centimeters. He stumbled backward with a shout, falling onto the road. Chaos erupted. Soldiers shouted. One fired his rifle blindly into the trees. Another scrambled to pull the injured man away, unhurt but shaken. Ein Fall, Mehrere fallen, a trap, multiple traps. The squad leader barked orders. Men scanned the road with renewed fear. The armored car accelerated forward to illuminate the path. It was a mistake. Its wheels rolled past the first exposed trap safe, but 10 meters ahead, hidden beneath pine needles, lay the next. The front axle struck the tripline. A metallic whip crack tore through the night. The scout car veered violently, its steering yanked sideways as the shovel blade tore into the tie rod. The vehicle pitched into the ditch with a grinding howl, throwing sparks as its side scraped the rocks. "Got him, Himmel!" Another soldier screamed as he dove aside. A silence followed, a stunned, disbelieving silence. The forest seemed to breathe. 2 vehicles disabled. No shots fired by the Poles. Only steel and rust. The Germans retreated from the road, entirely dragging their wounded, abandoning the wrecked vehicles until morning. They would return with engineers, with caution, with fear, but the road was closed. Alexander watched as the last flashlight beam vanished into the trees. He exhaled slowly, tension leaving him like smoke from a snuffed flame. Merck clapped a hand on his shoulder. "You closed it," he whispered. "They won't forget tonight." Alexander stared at the road littered with metal and silence. "Neither will I." Dawn crept slowly over the forest, a pale wash of light filtering through skeletal branches. The mist that lingered over the forest road glowed faintly, softening the jagged silhouettes of the wrecked vehicles. The Kübelwagen still lay crumpled against the ditch, its wheel twisted like broken bone. Behind it, the armored scout car rested on its side hull dented axle, torn nearly in half the gouges from the rusted shovel head stark against the exposed steel. The morning air was sharp enough to sting the lungs. Frost clung to the leaves. The world felt muted, too still after the violence of the night. From a ridge overlooking the road, Corporal Alexander Rosicki watched the Germans return. A column of infantry approached cautiously, rifles raised, boots crunching on frozen soil. Behind them came recovery engineers with tools slung over their shoulders and a light half-track towing equipment. They stopped 50 meters from the first trap and began probing the road with bayonets, testing every patch of dirt before stepping forward. Alexander crouched beside Merck in the underbrush. Both were concealed beneath frost-covered branches, their bodies stiff from hours of lying still. "Look at them," Merck whispered. "They're stepping like it's a minefield." "It is one," Alexander murmured, "just not the kind they know." The Germans dismantled one of the shovel traps, carefully studying it with confusion. The sapper officer turned the mechanism in his hands, frowning deeply. He held it up for the others to see. Even from this distance, Alexander could sense the disbelief. A rusted farm shovel, wire, a hinge from a barn door. A hand-split stake, nothing more, nothing less. An engineer spoke sharply. Another shook his head. Their voices carried faintly through the cold air. Merck smirked. "They can't believe it." "Neither could our own officers," Alexander said quietly. The Germans eventually began loading the crippled scout car onto a recovery truck, grunting with effort as they wrestled the twisted axle into place. It would take them hours to clear the road. By then, their scouting schedule would be ruined. Their movements delayed, their commanders frustrated. A small victory, unseen, uncelebrated, but real, and sometimes that was all a sapper could hope for. The Poles withdrew long before the Germans finished their work. By noon, they reached the rally point, an abandoned hunting cabin deep in the forest. Smoke from a tiny concealed fire drifted through the missing roof beams. Men sat in small groups eating thin soup heated in mess tins, their voices low but alive with satisfaction. Alexander arrived last, the weight of exhaustion settling into his bones. Major Wysocki stepped forward. "Corporal Rozicki," he said. "Report." Alexander straightened, though his back ached. "Sir, the traps performed as intended. 2 vehicles disabled. The Germans retreated. They're clearing the road now, but slowly." Wysocki nodded. "Any casualties among our men?" "None, sir." A murmur of relief rippled through the platoon. The major placed a gloved hand on Alexander's shoulder. "You've done more than build a device. You've given us time, and time is the sharpest weapon we have." Alexander lowered his gaze. Praise sat uneasily with him. He didn't feel like an inventor or a hero, just a tired man who had done what the moment required. He moved to sit beside Merck, but the major spoke again. "One more thing." Alexander turned. "You are hereby promoted to sergeant, effective immediately." Silence followed, then a wave of applause, quiet but sincere. Alexander felt heat rise to his face. He hadn't expected this. He hadn't wanted it. But something inside him softened at the sound, the acknowledgement not of rank but of contribution. He nodded once firmly. "Thank you, sir." That evening, as the men prepared to move again, new orders, new sabotage, new roads, Alexander stepped outside the cabin. Snow had begun to fall, lightly dusting the forest in a thin white sheen. The world looked momentarily peaceful. He sat on a fallen log, holding one of the remaining shovel blades. It rested across his knees like a relic. Merck joined him, kicking snow from his boots. "You know what the men are calling it now?" Merck asked. "Calling what? Your trap?" Alexander shook his head. "They say, the rusted jaw." Alexander let out a quiet breath, half amusement, half disbelief. "It's just a shovel," Merck laughed under his breath. "Maybe, but last night it bit harder than anything we've used in months." The snow fell harder, the flakes landing on the rusted metal and melting instantly. Alexander looked at the blade, tracing its edge with his thumb. "It won't win the war," no, Merck said, "but it kept us alive. That counts." Alexander nodded slowly. War was not won by grand moments alone, not by famous battles or sweeping offensives. It was shaped in the margins, in the quiet, unseen actions of men who improvised, adapted, and refused to surrender to despair. A rusted shovel on a forgotten forest road could delay a patrol, which delayed a regiment, which delayed a division, ripples spreading outward across the battlefield. Sometimes victory began with the smallest dent in the enemy's advance. Sometimes it began with a single idea. History would not record Alexander Rozicki's name. His traps would not appear in military textbooks. His invention would be overshadowed by tanks, artillery, and strategies drawn by men with higher ranks and cleaner uniforms. But for the men of the 32nd Sapper Platoon, the story would remain. The night Alexander's rusted shovel closed a road the Germans thought they owned. The night the overlooked became the decisive. The night desperation turned into ingenuity. And long after the war ended, long after the forests grew back and the rusted vehicles were swallowed by moss, veterans would tell the same quiet tale around kitchen tables and dim pub corners. He made a weapon out of nothing. And for one night it changed everything. Alexander never sought recognition. He never patented his design. He never spoke proudly of it. But years later, when peace finally came and he walked once more through the forests of his youth, he paused by a broken tree stump and ran a hand over the soil, remembering the sound of a shovel snapping upward in the dark. A simple tool, a simple idea, a simple act of resistance. He closed his eyes. In that moment the war felt far away, reduced to echoes, faded but not forgotten. And the rusted shovel in his memory gleamed like steel.